Yeah, I mean that was a difficult one to watch. I didn't think that the interviewer did great on that BBC interview, but I think it doesn't reduce the amount of bullshit that Peterson was putting out there.
Okay.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, he's clearly I think he's quite well respected in maybe psychological teaching circles or something like that.
Mhm.
I have watched some of his classes, so I'm not like totally ignorant of what he teaches. But like I think that when it comes to his like social commentary, there's clearly something off about the way he's putting it. And I don't know. I don't think the interviewer really challenged him properly about that, but I think that he didn't do himself any favors in that either.
I see. Yeah, I thought that particular interview, and we can kind of get off of that in a second, but that particular interview wasn't necessarily an example of Jordan Peterson's intellectual prowess in as much as it was, negligence on the part of the interviewer.
Right, but I think what was telling about that interview was the way that Jordan responds to being challenged. Like even if it was sort of a half-hearted or like a really poorly researched challenge to his positions, um, like the way that he responded wasn't really to like actually delve into those positions. It was more like it was a bit of derision, a bit of condescension. He sort of asserted that he was a clinical psychologist, and so he didn't have to back up any of his assertions, and it seemed like he was really ready to turn the conversation towards his like given topic, right, which is generally that the cultural Marxists are somehow poisoning the culture at large, right? Um, so I
Which
think it's not
I'm kidding.
well, okay. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that they're not, but like I think that um, like as a tactic for dealing with an interviewer, right? Like that's clearly not an actual way of like dealing with the topic. That's a way of sort of broadcasting your pet issues, right? And like I don't know, to me that sounds like dog whistle stuff, right? Where he's got an audience that he knows he's broadcasting to and he's selling to, and he needs to get those digs in whenever he can, right? Like he needs to make it clear that their enemy is his enemy. And I think that's what's going on with Jordan B. Peterson. I don't really see much content from him. I see more a sharing of enemies that's making some pretty strange bedfellows at this point.
Interesting. See, I thought that that particular interview didn't necessarily do any favors. That particular interview didn't do any favors for the interviewer, but I thought that the way that Jordan Peterson had answered the questions, I thought was totally legit. But unfortunately, it does sound like rhetorical clickbait because it's like
Mm.
like what he does is he quotes research, but the terms when you talk stoically about research that shows that women score higher on neurosis, there's no nice way to do that, right? And there's no nice way of like making those points, and he doesn't mince his words. He states things very matter of factly, and then he gets challenged on them. Do you think that all women are neurotic, or sir, is what you're saying is what you're saying is what you're saying? And he's like, no, that's not what I said, right? Because he's working from the position that like the behavior of groups on average does not dictate the behavior of any individual, right? But he doesn't say that up front because you normally don't have to. Normally there's a level playing field from which you're both working that you can make these statements without having to qualify them like that. That's how I took that interview.
Um, I think I get what you're saying. Like he is quoting research, but I think that there's a real problem in the way that he discusses like normative roles or the way that we discuss masculinity and femininity in culture, right? Where he goes on to admit that like women need like he goes on to say that like he's teaching women to be more aggressive like men, right? Like to take on more of these masculine traits in order to be successful in the workplace, but doesn't seem to acknowledge that it's like those expectations that success only comes from masculine traits that sort of leads to an inherent sexism in the workplace, right? And does lead women to have to take on those traits in order to succeed, right? And like that's not necessarily like that might be a way of stating how it is, but it's not a way of stating how it should be or how we're trying to alter that particular reality, right?
Sure.
So like
And he
I
always
think,
brings up
yeah,
the Scandinavian countries, and he kind of pulls the is ought fallacy, where it's like, well, given your druthers, like they do in Scandinavian, blah 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 blah, men, there's go towards engineering, women go towards veterinary medicine, and this, that, and the other. There's where there is equal opportunity in getting the gigs, there are these gender differences. There seems to be the gender dimorphism. Um, it's not literally dimorphism, but there seems to be specific phenotypical behaviors that might be considered biological genotypical origin, right, between genders. And then he brings up those points, but then to your point, he doesn't necessarily make a statement about how things ought to be. He just keeps defending the way that things are. Here's how things are. Biologically, we're different. Here's evidence that we're biologically different. Why get in the way of nature? That seems to be where he's coming from. Do you get something different from him?
yeah, I find a lot of similar assertions that he makes with a lot of how he puts things, like his claim that we have sort of this like inherent dependency on hierarchy, and he uses that weird example of the lobster to discuss that, right? Like where serotonin levels can affect their position in society, and that somehow it's a reflection of human based needs for hierarchy in their social interactions.
Yeah, well,
I don't know, like,
he's pulling classic moves. So when I hear that and I see people critique it, I understand the critique, but and maybe I'm and maybe this is my bias, and maybe this is a perfect example, a stereo or a prototypical example of where bias comes into play to see the same exact thing two different ways. Because when I see him bring up those kinds of examples, I tacitly assume that he's making a general claim about like our desire, our natural propensity to adhere to hierarchies. And then I see him use the lobsters as a comparative psychology example, right? If this behavior can be seen across organisms, assuming an evolutionary timeline, then we can say that, like, oh, well, this isn't a human specific thing, this isn't a mammal specific thing, this isn't a whatever specific thing. We can say that this is nature, this isn't something to fight against. This is, I guess, in a way, what he's saying is this is a tempest in a teapot kind of thing, or a tempest in a teacup kind of thing. It's not that big of a deal. This is what nature is. Here's an example of lobsters doing the same thing. And he has other examples, but that's how I interpret what he's saying.
right. I'm not necessarily saying that he's not right in pointing out all those examples in nature, or even to say that evolutionarily there may have been a role of hierarchy in our development, right? But like, it's obviously the naturalistic fallacy to claim that somehow just because we've been evolved to do something that we ought to do that, right? It seems to me like there's somehow a disconnect there between what he's advocating for, which seems to be a return to conservative fundamentalist sort of I don't know, just more set up and maintained gender roles and stereotypes. Like the disconnect between that and just pointing out that we have these things, right? That somehow humans have these inherently. It seems like we're inheriting some sort of social adaptation, right? Like that we arrange ourselves in hierarchies quite easily, and I think like that's weird. It's weird to think that, like, even if hierarchies are somehow evolved, right? What hierarchy are we meant to follow? Like that's the real question, right? And like what he's saying is the hierarchy we followed 60 years ago is the one we should be following. And I think that that's a problematic argument, right? It doesn't get us any closer to saying what we ought to do.
I don't see him advocating for that, right? I see him stopping short of that. I see him making observational statements about how things are, not making normative statements. I don't really see him, aside from his like self-help side of things. That's what these 12 steps are, and he wants to make men men and women women, and by that I guess he means to empower everybody.
But Chris, I think a lot of that has to do, just to play devil's advocate, because I'm actually pretty much in the middle between you two guys on this specific opinion. He knows that, let's be honest, the fanboys that he attracts are people who are like sort of young male, quote unquote atheist community circa 2009 on YouTube. Like that's a lot of his fans and a lot of people who don't explicitly identify with a sort of a Judeo-Christian bent of things. But so if he was to say something like, which you can see a lot of the stuff is when he talks about religion, if he was to really out and out say like, you know what, I want a Christian society of the 1950s, like John is saying, I mean, that would be killer for his marketing. Like, I don't make the mistake of thinking that he's a dope. I actually think he's a very smart guy in his marketing because he knows he's marketing to young male, fairly irreligious people. Like that is his marketing demographic right
now. Wait, there's something that you just said, Sam. I don't think that he's a dope either. And so part of the charm of Jordan Peterson to me is his ability to, when explaining something or giving his rationale, the narrative, the arc of his narrative is logical. It seems compelling. He says it with confidence, and he also dips into Freudian psychology and Jungian or Freudian psychoanalysis specifically, and then the Jungian branch of that, and then the Joseph Campbell kind of processing of myth, Hero of a Thousand Faces kind of stuff. I like how he interweaves all of that, but at the same time, I've kind of been trained to think that stuff's not science and it doesn't have value. So I'm charmed. When he talks, I'm charmed because he uses a language that is dusty, but I'm smelling what he's selling. I know where he's going with the points that he's making, and I love the fact that he's bringing that kind of language into the public forum, but at the same time, I hate it because it gives validity to these Jungian, Joseph Campbell-like ideas as if they're anything more important than just super fun hypotheses.
Well, the issue that I almost take with him on that stuff is the fact that, I mean, some of his followers just have, and I know this because a lot of Joe Rogan, people who are fanboys of Joe Rogan are fanboys of Jordan Peterson, and I do jujitsu. So no shortage of the two. And people will ask me, and I go, well, honestly, like a lot of his stuff, the stuff that you really gel with, that he presents really interestingly, like I'm able to recognize, okay, these are not terribly revolutionary or new ideas, and I can pick out a lot of the problems with some of the reasoning. Like he'll say wackadoo shit that I'm amazed no one latches onto. Like he was on on the podcast that Joe Rogan had with him and Brett Weinstein. He said that he viewed the Bible as, and I think the quote was, a piece of evolutionary psychological book of wisdom and a guide to living life. And you're just like, it's a silly thing to say. There's aspects of it that might be correct, but there's an aspect of it where you just sort of roll your eyes and you go, how do you, like, Brett Weinstein is a smart man. He did his PhD thesis under Richard Lewontin, does not even remotely challenge that as a talking point. Joe Rogan doesn't remotely challenge it. And so the issue is that he says these things where you and we can have a discussion about these points because we were, you're more conversant with the psychology stuff than me, but we're conversant in a lot of these topics. The problem is that someone like Joe Rogan, and I love Joe Rogan, but he's not conversant in how to think critically about these types of issues. He's just not. I've listened to his podcast enough to know that. So it's one of those things where it's not that I think that people don't call, for whatever reason, Jordan Peterson doesn't get called on saying just really wackadoo shit.
Yeah, I would have to push back on you, Chris. I don't think that he is especially coherent when he talks, right? Like, I think maybe you're filling in a lot of the storyline that he's skipping over, or that you're picking up on some of the words that he's using, and so you're naturally moving to the same what seems like an abstract thought to everybody else. But like I've heard lots of interviews with him where his ability to directly answer a question is like limited. Like he cannot do it. And like once he gets started on a sentence, it's almost like the paragraph has written itself in his head and he's gone on something else. And I mean, listen, I don't mind psychology. I think that psychology is great. I really do appreciate all of the stuff that it's added to our understanding of human behavior and the way that we interact with each other. But I think that psychoanalysis in lieu of argument is one of the main. All I'm saying is, yeah.
Hold on.
Go ahead, please.
I say that I love psychology too, and in fact, I say that the Kalam cosmological argument is the bitch of psychology.
All right. I'll think about that. But I think what bothers me most about Peterson is his use of like psychoanalysis in lieu of an argument, right? Like to simply psychoanalyze the person challenging you in order to dismiss them is like literally the most bankrupt way of using psychoanalysis you can, right? Like that's not a way of actually advancing the conversation.
Well, I mean, John, not to interrupt, but like you just set me up. Like he's a lot of the time he's not particularly good at it, and I had a friend who linked me his little thing about the problem. It was the problem with Sam Harris or the problem with Richard Dawkins. It was this thing where he did a literary analysis of Crime and Punishment, and I read that as an 18-year-old in AP English, and I don't like literature classes. I'm not good at them, and I had a better analysis of that fucking book than he did. That kind of shit frustrates me because people. What frustrates me more is his following more than the fact that he says stupid shit. Because you know what, I could have just listened his analysis of Crime and Punishment. I could have just listened to Matt Slick talk about it. It would have been the same thing.
Wow. That's
Like because like I don't think that Jordan Peterson's stupid or unintelligent, right? Like I don't for a second think that he is illiterate or anything like that.
Stupid head. That's what you said.
I did. I said that he probably enjoys the smell of his own farts, but I don't know if that's exactly the same.
Totally different.
Yeah, totally. No, I think he says some silly shit. Like he the problem is like it's kind of with a lot of this shit where they'll say really intelligent. A lot of these people will say really intelligent things if it applies to their field in their specific area, but it's scattershot if it's not about it, right? Like I listened to Sam Harris's podcast with Charles Murray. Listening to Sam Harris try to understand genetics is just like, oh man, I might as well like. It's frustrating to me because that's what I study. So it's one of those things where I think like there seems to be this weird movement right now towards almost like it's like the new polymath, where like in academia you can't really be a polymath at this point. It's just not particularly realistic because there's just too many subspecialty areas. But in a lot of these public communicators almost come off as if they're they're trying to come off as if they're polymaths, and it's one of those things that frustrates me. Maybe that's just me though.